Om Jnanatimirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurmilitan Jena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. So we are continuing with our weekly Bhagavad Gita study discussion group, Hidden Treasure of the Sweet Absolute. And we are in the middle of chapter 3 on karma, which is primarily discussing the principle of karma yoga, path of selfless action. Okay, I'm going to start our screen share. We're going to review some of the verses we went through last week and also hear Srila Govinda Maharaj chanting those verses. Okay, let me do a screen share and let me also share the sound. Okay, I think that's the right one you want to share. Okay, so I'm going to pick up from verse 20. And we can just, please just read as we're going through and hear Srila Govinda Maharaj's divine vibration.
कर्मणैव हि संसिद्धि मास्थिता जनकादयः लोकसंग्रहमेवापि सम्पश्यन् कर्तुमर्हसि यच्चदाचरति श्रेष्ठ सत्तदेवेतरो जनः सा यत्प्रमाणं कुरुते लोकस्तद् अनुवर्तते न मे पार्थास्ति कर्तव्यम् त्रिषु लोकेषु किंचन नानावाप्तम् अवाप्तव्यम् वर्त एव च कर्मणि यदि इच्छां न वर्तेयं यातु कर्माण्यतन्द्रिता मम वर्तानुवर्तन्ते मनुष्याः पार्थ सर्वथा उत्सिदेयुरिमे लोकाः न कुर्यां कर्म चेदहम् शंकरस्य च कर्तास्यामुपहन्यामि मां प्रजाः सक्ताः कर्मण्य विद्वांसु यथा कुर्वन्ति भारत कुर्याद् विद्वांस्तथा सक्तः चिकीर्षु लोकसंग्रहम् न बुद्धिभेदं जनयेत् अज्ञानं कर्मसंगिनां योजयेत् सर्वकर्माणि विद्वान् युक्तः समाचरन् प्रकृते क्रियमाणानि गुणैः कर्माणि सर्वशः अहंकार विमूढात्मा कर्ताहमिति मन्यते तत्त्ववित्तु महाबाहो गुणकर्म विभागयो गुणागुणेषु वर्तन्त इति मत्वा न सज्जते प्रकृतिर्गुणसङ्गमूढः सज्जन्ते गुणकर्मसु तान कृष्ण विदु मंदान कृष्ण विद्न विचालयेत् मयि सर्वाणि कर्माणि संगनस्याध्यात्मचेतसा निराशीर्निर्ममो भूत्वा युद्धस्य विगतज्वरः.
Okay, so we just went through verses 20 to 30 here on the screen and audio. And welcome Dulal Krishna Prabhu, who just joined us. So some of you may recall that last week we had some discussion on this principle of not being the doer, right? Which is mentioned in this verse 27. Prakriti kriyamanani gunai karmani sarvasha ahankara vimudatma kartaham iti manyate. So it is every action in this world is accomplished by various factors, primarily the Lord's will in the background, and then so many energies and forces of the environment around us. But we, under the influence of our ahankara, we think of ourselves as the doer of everything. And then there's all this ego tied in with that of possessiveness and so on, right? So we discussed this last week. And yeah, and then I this verse, I think we wanted to discuss a little bit more. This verse 28. This is an interesting verse. I just find it very, very helpful. This Tattavitu mahabaho guna karma vibhagayaho guna guneshu vartanta iti matva na sajate. However, O mighty armed Arjuna, one who is in knowledge of the division of the modes of material nature and action, knows that the modes are engaging within the modes, and he is detached from them. One who knows that the three modes activated by the demigods impel the engagement of the senses with their objects, knows himself to be independent of these elements. Therefore, he does not consider himself a doer. So this is one of those verses in Bhagavad Gita, which is just painting a very clear picture of what is what. And you read these verses and it's like, oh, okay, that's what's going on. It's kind of like, like when you're unwell in some way and you're experiencing all these strange symptoms and you're just like, what's going on? And you're bewildered by them and suffering under the effect of them. But then you trying to work out, like, how can I solve this? What's the cause of it? What's the cure? Right. And then you finally meet a good doctor who knows what's going on and they give you a diagnosis. Like, oh, thank you. Like, there's actually so much comfort that comes just in knowing what's going on. Right. It's a funny thing. Just knowing it makes a huge difference. Then you start to feel like, oh, there's a way out. Like, now I have a diagnosis. There's a way out, right? There's a way forward. There is light, right? So this is what Bhagavad Gita is giving. Bhagavad Gita is giving us a diagnosis. Right? What is our actual condition? What's actually going on with her? What's the actual lowdown, right? Not based on what the media says or, sorry, got being distracted by all these people popping up. Not according to what politics says or the media says or my neighbor says, right, or my boss or my own sensory experience, right? That can be hard, right? Not what my own instincts and emotions and senses are telling me, but what is actually going on, right? According to higher vision, what's actually going on. So Bhagavad Gita is giving us that diagnosis, and it's such a relief. It's such a relief to have that type of clarity, right? And it's giving us this distance from our physical and sensory experience in this plane. So this, I just love this because it just kind of paints this picture of yourself as an observer, where you're like just watching. Oh, right, my tongue and my sense of taste is interacting with various, corresponding objects of taste. And there's this whole experience going on, right? And within that sensory plane, my eyes are interacting with the corresponding sense objects, my ears, right? And then more subtle, the more subtle it is, the more tricky it becomes, right? Because the more subtle it is, the more subtle it is, the more difficult it becomes to distinguish it from the true self, right? So like the mind, then you come to the mind a little more subtle. And the mind's pulling you this way, and the mind's pulling you that way, and the mind's getting you in trouble. But Bhagavad Gita is helping us to understand what's the mind and what's actually the true self. Right? And then the whole plane of ego, that's the most subtle and the most insidious. Our whole conception of self, our whole conception of I, me, and mine, that's all springing from the ahankar, the false ego. So Bhagavad Gita is painting that picture. This is the ahankar, right? And this is the true self. So you can kind of like just sit back and watch, like, oh, this is what's going on. Of course, we can't control it right now. It's just like when you get that diagnosis of the doctor, it's not that you're cured right now. You still got to suffer. But knowing that you have the diagnosis, it makes a world of difference. And knowing that there's stuff you can do, right? There's medicine you can take, there's foods you can eat, right? Exercise you can do that are going to help you get out of this condition, right? Having that glimmer of hope for the future makes all the difference, right? So Bhagavad Gita is giving that hope to us, giving us that clarity and giving us that hope, right? So yeah, I appreciate this verse very much. This gives us that distance. And then I think we already read through these verses actually. Yeah, I think we went up to verse 30. And then this verse 30 is very nice, right? This connected with this spirit of devotion where we can offer. We're not renouncing action, right? But we're offering it. We're channeling it. Connecting everything with our Lord. I'd love to hear some reflections from others in our group today. Ash looks like he has something to say. Anything you want to share, Ash? Okay.
Nothing I can think of at the moment. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for being present. That's very great. Okay, well, should we move on then? And we are set up with audio today, so we can continue. Hearing from Srila Govinda Maharaj's divine voice. Okay, we're going to pick up with verse 31.
Je me matamidang nittam anutishtanti manavaha श्रद्धावन्तु नसूयन्तु मुच्यन्ते तेऽपि कर्मभिः यत्ते तद्भसूयन्तो नानुतिष्ठन्ति मे मतम् सर्वज्ञानविमूढांस्तान् विद्धि नष्टान् अचेतसः सदृशं चेष्टते सस्या प्रकृतिर्ज्ञानवानपि प्रकृतिं जन्ति भूतानि निग्रहः किं करिष्यति इंद्रिय सेन्द्रिय स्वार्थे रागद्वेषौ अवस्थितौ तयोर्न वशमागच्छेत् तौ झस्य परिपन्थिनौ श्रेयान् सधर्मो विगुणः परधर्मात् सनुष्ठितात् सधर्मे निधनं श्रेयः परधर्मो भयावहः श्री अर्जुनुवाच अथ केन प्रयुक्तोऽयं पापंचरति पुरुष अनिच्छन्न विवार्ष्णेय बलादिव नियोजितः श्री भगवानुवाच काम एष क्रोध एष रजोगुणसमुद्भव महाशनो महापापना विद्धेनमिह वैरणम् धूमेनाव्रियते वह्निर्यथादर्शो मलेन च जथोल्लेनावृतो गर्भस्तथा तेनेदमावृतम् आवृतं ज्ञानमेतेन ज्ञानिनो नित्यवैरिणाः कामरूपेण कौन्तेय दुष्पुरेणानलेन च इन्द्रियाणि मनोबुद्धिरस्याधिष्ठानमुच्यते एतैर्विमोहयत्तेष ज्ञानमावृत्य देहिनम् तस्मात् तामिन्द्रियाण्यादौ नियम्य भरतर्षभ पाप्नानां प्रजहीच्छेनं ज्ञानविज्ञाननाशनम् इन्द्रियाणि पराण्याहुरिन्द्रियेभ्यः परं मनः मनसस्तु परा बुद्धिर्बुद्धिर्यः परतस्तु सः एवं बुद्धेः परं बुद्ध्या संस्तुभ्यात्मानमात्मना जहि सत्यं महाबाहो कामरूपं दुरासदम् इति श्री महाभारते सहस्रां संहितायां वैयासिकं भीष्मपर्वणि श्रीमद्भगवद्गीतासु उपनिषत्सु ब्रह्मविद्यायां योगशास्त्रे श्रीकृष्णार्जुन संवादे कर्मयोग नाम तृतीयोऽध्यायः।
Oh, All right. So it went a little over the usual 10 just because it was just a few extra verses till the end of the chapter. Well, let's chant the Sanskrit all together, and then maybe we can take turns hearing everyone reading verses, make it a little more interactive. So we'll go to 31, right? Okay. Yeme matam idam nityam manujishtanti manavaha shadavanto nasuyanto muchante depi karmibihi ye tveta davyasuyanto nanutishtanti me matam sarvagyana vimudam stan vidinashtana chetasaha sajisham cheshtate swasya prakrite jnanavanapi prakritim yanti bhutani nigraha kim karishyati Indriyasyarte ragadvesho vyavastito tayornavasha magachito yasya paripi pantino Shayan sadharma viguna paradharmat sanushtitat sadharme nidanam shreya paradharmo bhayavaha Arjuna vacha Atakena prayuktoyam papancharati purushaha Anichanapi Varshnaya Baladeva Niyojitaha Shri Bhagavanu Vacha Kamesha Prodesha Rajaguna Samudbhavaha Pahashano Mahapatma Vidyanam Iha Vaidinam Umena Riyate Vanir Yatadarsho Malena Cha Tato Benarito Garbhas Tata Dene Damavritam Avritam Jnanamitena Jnanino Nityavairina Kamarupena Kunteya Dushpurena Nalena Cha Indriyani Manobuddhir Asya Dishtana Muchate Ete Vimohayatnesha Jnanamavritya Dehinam Tasmatam Indriyanyado Niyamya Bharatarshaba Papmanam Prajahihenam Jnana Vijnana Nashanam Indriyani Paranyaho Indriyabhya Paramanaha Anasastu Parabuddhir Buddhirya Paratastu Sa Evam Buddhe Param Buddhva Samstabhyatmanam Atmana Raishacham Mahabaho Tamarupam Durasadam. Okay. So quite a lot here to cover, and there are quite a few key verses here. It'll be a lot. We probably won't get through discussing all of them today. Okay. Well, maybe we could all take turns. Welcome Anu Krishna, who's joined us. So we're going from 31. Faithful, unbegrudging men who always practice my teaching, this yoga of selfless action, are liberated from the bondage of action, even though they engage in action. Maybe do you all just want to jump in when you're ready? Read the next verse. Well, I'll read the arrogant, scary one. Okay, sorry, Gangalila, go ahead.
But the arrogant who resent my teachings are bereft of all knowledge. Know them to be lost in ignorance.
For even a knowledgeable person tends to act according to his nature of mundane inclinations. The living beings endeavored are dictated by their natures. What, then, can repression accomplish?
Although the senses are attracted to and repelled by the sense objects, one must be controlled by these urges, for they are the greatest enemy of the candidate for self-realization.
Even if it is imperfect, it is better to do one's duty according to one's own nature than to do another's well. Even death in the discharge of one's own duty is better, or to perform another's is dangerous. And shall I read the commentary as well, or just the verse?
Go ahead.
Commentary. The eternal, super excellent natural function, dharma, of the soul is pure devotion for adhokshada, the
Adhokshada.
transcendental Lord. Ahokshada, the transcendental Lord. Therefore, even if this function is somewhat imperfectly attempted by one with external malpractices, such an attempt will be superior to the good practices within the material modes of nature and worldly chain of actions and habits forward to the soul's nature. Even if death occurs during the cultivation of such pure devotion in proper saintly association, it is the bestower of the ultimate good. But in the name of good practices, to ignorantly follow, quote, another's path, anything other than devotion for the Lord, I don't feel comfortable reading that word, is bayava, endangering to the spiritual progress of the soul.
Shall I read that verse?
Go for it.
Bayam dritya biniveshatasya ishadapetasya viparya yospriti tanmayaya to buddha abhajetam bhaktyayika yesham guru devatatma.
A person of fine intelligence will serve with single-minded devotion his Lord who is his teacher and dearmost friend. But those who have turned away from the Lord adopt the illusory ego of considering the perishable body to be the self, forgetting their true intentions. Their consciousness absorbed in secondary identity. Forgetting their true identities. What did I say?
Intentions.
Forgetting their true identity. Their consciousness is absorbed in secondary pursuits, i.e., mundane objects. They're always fearful on account of the body and its attachment. I read to 11:2:37.
Okay, great. Okay, someone else going to jump in now, read the translation to 36.
Arjuna inquired, O descendant of the Vrishnis, by what is the living being compelled to commit sinful activities, even unwillingly, as if by force? The Supreme Lord replied, it is the desire to enjoy the mundane that induces a person to commit sin, and in different situations it produces anger. It is utterly insatiable, extremely malicious, and the worst enemy of the living being in this world.
As fire is thinly veiled by smoke, as a mirror is thickly covered with dust, and as the embryo remains completely enclosed within the womb, similarly, this desire covers the consciousness of the living being. In these 3 degrees of intensity, according to the modes of material nature, goodness, passion, and ignorance, respectively.
Knowledge is covered by desire, the constant enemy of the wise. It burns like an insatiable fire, never satisfied by offerings of butter.
It is said that the enemy desire dwelling within the senses, mind, and intelligence covers the perception of the embodied living being and deludes him. Therefore, O noblest of the Bharatas, control your senses and destroy this desire, the embodiment of sin, which destroys both knowledge and realization.
It is said by the wise. Oh, go ahead.
It is said by the wise that the senses are superior to matter, the mind is superior to the senses, and the intelligence is superior to the mind, and the soul is superior to even the intelligence. When we come back to this, we might talk about the differences between the intelligence and the mind, because that's not a Western concept, so sometimes it's a little confusing.
Okay, yeah, I love to talk about that actually. So yeah, we'll talk about it. O mighty Arjuna, knowing the soul to be superior to the intelligence, steady the mind with resolute intelligence and destroy the formidable enemy, desire. Okay, so yeah, as I said, quite a few key verses here, a lot to discuss. But before we dive in, does anyone in our group today want to share any thoughts that come to mind? And welcome those of you who have joined. And Scarlett joined, Dana, We have a mysterious Gita 108. Love it. Okay, so let's see here. We picked up from 31. So I like this point. This comes up again and again, right? It's not about repression. It's about proper expression. This is one of the, this is a theme that comes up again and again here in Gita. Then a warning to, how the senses can just blind you. We have to be aware of that. Don't let our senses dictate to us, right? And Srila Sridhar Maharaj, he phrased this in an interesting way, because generally in the West, there's this kind of celebration of freedom, as the concept of freedom is being able to do whatever you want, right? But Srila Sridhar Maharaj, he phrased this in an interesting way. He said, like, what is it that we want? Freedom of the senses or freedom from the senses, right? Because it's actually a type of slavery, right? If we're just living according to the dictates of our senses, right? That's not real freedom. And in Sanskrit, there's a word, swadhinata, Srila Sridhar Maharaj explained, which is used to mean freedom. And what it actually means is self-mastery. That's real freedom. That's real freedom. You have mastery of the self. That gives one true freedom. And so we have to be aware, be a little vigilant, right, about that. Now, this is like a whole discussion and a half, this verse 35. Even if it is imperfect, it is better to do one's duty according to one's own nature than to do another's well. Even death in the discharge of one's own duty is better, for to perform another's is dangerous. So this is this is a bit of a can of worms, this verse, because it's, we're all at different stages in our journey. We're all learning different lessons, and there needs to be some level of awareness, self-awareness as to what that is. Of course, best thing is if we have clear guidance from a trusted advisor, right? Guru and Vaishnava, as well as some self-awareness too, like what's appropriate for us and what is our lesson right now, and mind your own business, right? That's also kind of implied here. Srila Sridhar Maharaj has quoted that expression, mind your own business. We don't need to be so eager about judging or instructing others in their duty or taking up the duty of another, but understand, what is my lesson right now? What is my duty? Dive deep into that. And that, of course, is one of Srila Sridhar Maharaj's famous expressions, right? Dive deep into reality. Dive deep into reality. So, our tendency is to be living on the surface, right? What's presently in front of us in the plane of our mind, senses, physical experience. But reality is happening at a much deeper level. So let's dive deep into what's before us right now. What is our duty? What is our lesson right now? And that's something that has to be ascertained, with some serious introspection, self-reflection, and consultation with trusted advisors as well, ideally, if possible. And then now there's another layer here, and I think it's coming from Bhaktivinoda Thakur, is it? Oh no, that's another one I'm thinking of. But here in Srila Sridhar Maharaj's purport, he draws out another meaning here in this verse, that he takes it from this kind of like bigger picture view, or absolute view. I think that's what I want to say. He takes this absolute perspective, that our real duty is loving service to Krishna, right? And so even if we carry that out imperfectly, that's better than to carry out another duty perfectly, right? To the eternal, super excellent, natural dharma of the soul is pure devotion to Krishna. And then this is a this is a very interesting verse here in Srimad Bhagavatam, this Bhayam Dvita, and this is quoted sometimes by our gurus. And it's kind of like discussing our whole situation in this world, you know, how we got here and how we can try to get out. And the root of it all is this Dvitiya Binivesh, which literally means, this Dvitiya means two, second. So to Dvitiya Binivesh means to be absorbed in secondary interest, right? Because actually there's only one interest, there's one show, right? There's one movie. That's the Krishna movie, right? And any other narrative that we are living by is a projection, right? Because there's only the Krishna narrative. And we also have a place there. We have a wonderful part, you know, supporting character part. So we definitely have a place there. But if we are living in a reality where we're putting ourselves in the center and it's based upon our temporary existence in this current lifetime, that's a projection, right? So how did we end up here, and how are we sustaining ourselves here with this Dvitiya Binivesh, this absorption in the secondary interest? There's only there's only one flow, actually. That's the Krishna flow. And we have a beautiful part to play, and we're part of that dance, right? But unfortunately, we are somewhat blind to that at present. And so this verse is, and the first line, it can be kind of isolated, and it's very interesting on its own. And Srila Sridhar Maharaj, he discusses this concept in a very wonderful way. So this baya, or boy, if you're in Bengal, means fear. And so it's saying, this first line just by itself is saying that fear arises, syat, arises from having a secondary interest. So from disconnecting from our guardian. That's the way Srila Sridhar Maharaj expresses it in one discussion. Lack of guardian consciousness. This is the origin of fear, right? When we are not living in that awareness that my guardian is over my head, that there's no accident, but my loving creator, my loving guardian is behind everything, then there's no need to be fearful, right? Fear comes about when we're living in an isolated mentality. That is just, it's me against the world, right? And I have to look out for myself because the world's against me. And I'm always like kind of living in this fear. But when one is living in spiritual consciousness, they truly see every wave is favorable. The Lord's presence is behind everything. And even if it's apparently unfavorable, it's actually favorable. So there's this fearlessness that comes in that mentality with that vision, right? So this is a whole interesting discussion itself, this first line. And then how does one move back to the Lord? This Tanmayayato Buddha Abhajetam Bhaktyaya Kayesham Guru Deva Tatam, by taking shelter of the Lord and Guru in this very intimate way. This Deva Tatma, this word Atma here is interesting because this word Atma, generally it means the self, right? I think everybody knows that word. It means the soul or the self. But in this verse, and there are a lot of commentaries that have been made by our acharyas on this verse. And it's explained in this verse, it's used in the sense of very dear. Because what is more dear than the self? More close and more dear than the self, right? So there's this intimacy, approaching our spiritual guardians with this feeling of closeness and affection, intimacy, wholeheartedly, right? Wholeheartedly taking shelter. Now we got to remember, Arjuna is kind of like representing all of us. He's standing in our corner and he's asking the questions that we might ask. He was like, sometimes I do stuff and I'm like, why did I do that? Like, I didn't want to do that. Why do we do stuff that we don't want to do sometimes? Like we're just compelled. What's that about? What's up with that, right? It's like, oh, thanks, Arjuna. I had the same question. How did I react in that way? Or how did I do that thing? What was that? What the hell was that? And so Krishna gives this very nice explanation here about calm, right? Lust or desire. So it is this calm that induces us to commit sin. And is it here? But what, I don't know if maybe there's another verse where it's described more elaborately. Yeah, there's another verse too. But see, this is an interesting point that's being indicated here. Oh, I see Marie has raised her hand. Get to just a second. This is an interesting point here because what's being implied is, you know, when you develop this when you have desire for something, it's mentioning here in different situations, it produces anger. Why is that? Because when you can't get what you want, right? And I'm 90% sure there's another verse in Gita which is elaborating on it more. So when you can't, you have desire for something and then you're denied it. That produces anger, right? That produces anger. It is utterly insatiable, extremely malicious, and the worst enemy of a living being in this world, because it can compel you to do things that get you in serious trouble, can have long-term consequences for yourself and others, and you didn't even really want to do them in the first place, but it's just like this urge that will come over you, right? Okay, well, Marie has her hand raised. We'd love to hear from her. Welcome, Ananta Krishna Prabhu, tuning in from SoCal Seva Asha.
I wanted to say that what the description here, it's the desire to enjoy the mundane that induces a person to commit sin. I think that wording is right to talk to Arjuna because he's a relatively privileged male, and most of the scholars who will study the Gita for centuries will be relatively privileged males. But I think it's also important to understand that sometimes that desire to enjoy is really the desire to avoid fear or pain, which goes back to that whole guardian awareness thing. And so people with less privilege, they'd be saying, what do you mean desire to enjoy? I'm just trying to survive. But still, it's that focus on it. And that the anger then comes not so much from not getting your way as not having your perceived needs met in the time that you would prefer. So like, you know, if a toddler's throwing a fit, like we do, you know, sometimes it's because they need a nap, but they think it's because they need the candy bar, you know, and so sometimes we're getting what we need and we don't realize we're getting what we need, or we're going to get what we need at the right time, but it isn't that time yet. And it's very frustrating because in the meantime, we feel misunderstood and we feel abandoned. And then that fear sets in, and anger is a secondary emotion always. So it can come as secondary to pride or to desire. It also comes secondary to fear. Why am I not getting my needs met? Everyone else seems to be getting their needs met. How come this is, you know? So I guess I don't have a concluding thought. I guess those were just bits around that I wanted to tease out.
Well, I love those comments. I love those reflections. You make some really great points. I would add to that I would say that whether or not something is considered sinful, and I think we all agree we don't really like that word, but you know, what are we going to do? It's just a word. It's just like scary word, isn't it? But anyway, let's say the Sanskrit. You know, I when I was in in Japan, because actually they don't like using the word God is not so, okay. But what I discovered a workaround was saying Bhagavan. They were cool with Bhagavan. Bhagavan is the Sanskrit word for like personal God, right? So because some things that people have certain associate. I mean, a lot of places nowadays you can't really say the G word, right? So workarounds. So let's say pop. Pop sounds better to me. For sin. Here, pop. This is the word for sin in Sanskrit. So one thing that I'd like to mention here is that what constitutes pop, I would say, depends on the circumstances. And in the scenario that you described, like if someone's acting out of need for survival, I don't think that would be lower on the bar. It wouldn't be in the same category as someone just acting, according to their whim and whatever, right? But if someone's just acting out of a basic need for survival, of course, everything in this world is reactionary, whether it's good or bad, but I would say it's a different category, and the reaction would be less. I would say that. But that's just as
It's
a
more
side note to what you said. I love everything that you said.
Yeah, it's more of the sin in the sense that sin is a thing that creates a barrier between us and the Lord. That's often of our own emotions or our own thought patterns, and less of something that is actually actively harmful to others that creates that barrier. So yeah, it's a different flavor of the pop.
That's an interesting angle. I like that. Something that creates a barrier between. That's a very harmonizing and sweet way to think of sin, actually. I love that.
I was so lucky to grow up with the mother I had. I have none of those negative sin word connotations that so many people have.
Okay, I'm putting that one in my notebook. It's something that creates a barrier between us and the Lord. I love that. I love that. Brilliant. Yeah, see, because I mean, like in scriptural language, these things are kind of heavy like this, and I understand it has a purpose, right? And also you could say some of it is for a particular section who needs strong language, right? But like for example, the way that our Gurudev Srila Govindamars, he would never speak like that, because it was kind of like he was speaking to a more mature group who actually are doing this out of love, right? And as soon as love is involved, all these other discussions become irrelevant, right? Because it's not about being rewarded for good and punished for bad, but what do you want? What's actually giving you joy? And where the love is, right? So it's just a completely different angle. So I'm kind of like alienated by some of these words and discussions, because to me it's kind of like just not relevant. Like it's not really part of the main conversation, But of course it's here for a purpose, and it is helpful just to understand how things work in this world, know how the plumbing works, and understand the nature of karma, right? That's kind of how I see it. But anyway, I really like that expression. Now this is really helpful. I like this analogy that's given here in verse 38. Three analogies that are given to describe how the different modes of material nature cover us in different degrees, right? When the mode of, and of course later in Gita, there will be a more extensive discussion of the nature of each of these different modes, right? So the mode of ignorance is the most heavy covering over us, that's completely blinding us from the true self. And that's compared to an embryo, right? Being completely heavily covered, right? Within the womb. And then the mode of passion is compared to a mirror that's thickly covered with dust. So it's not quite as thick, the covering, but it's still pretty thick. And then here, then the mode of, I mean, I really, really like these analogies. Fire. So the mode of goodness is compared to fire that's veiled by smoke. So that's that mode, the sattva gun, right? The mode of goodness. It's you're getting some dim perception, right, of the true self, right? The light of the soul. It's still a covering, right? Because as we're always mentioning time and time again, the mode of goodness is not the goal, right? So it's still a covering, but it's a lot easier to work with, right? The picture of the soul is coming through somewhat, right? You're getting closer. So that's why we generally try to live a life in the mode of goodness. That's creating a favorable environment for our spiritual practice. So I find that a very helpful verse. Knowledge is covered by desire, the constant enemy of the wise. Okay, so now this verse, so this Marie wanted to more on this, and this is a really key verse. This is a verse that's discussed. It's quoted, fairly often by our gurus, particularly Srila Maharaj. I've seen him discuss this in several cases, and it gives a very helpful outline of these different layers of our existence within gradation. So most gross is the objects of the senses, right? And then there's the senses, which are engaging with the objects of the senses, our first contact with this world. Then and I can also mention Srila Maharaj. There are at least 2 places I can think of where he gives a really nice explanation. So I would, maybe I should, I have it. Actually, let me just look it up right now. I can give you the reference. Or what? Maybe we can just read it. Indriyani. Okay, there's too many hits here. Okay, well, I can share it later, or I'll try to remember to do that. So our senses, they're collecting the information, right? Sense of touch, taste, smell, sight, collecting information. We are running out of time as well. They're collecting information from the environment, and they're depositing it with the mind, right? Now the mind has this binary nature. It's just acting. So this is the distinction that is made in the Vedic discourse, right? The mind is an element within us that has this binary nature and simply functions in liking or disliking, right? Based upon the pool of information given by our ego. Then the mind is telling us, I like this or I don't like this. This is a friend, this is an enemy. This, I want this because it tastes good. I don't want this because it doesn't taste good. I like this person because they helped me get a promotion. I don't like this person because they didn't give me a promotion. That's like the nature of the mind. And the mind doesn't discriminate, And so this weekend, and this is mentioned later in Gita, right? How we can actually use the mind. We can train the mind. I like to think of the mind as like a sniffer dog. Those sniffer dogs, like they get trained to detect, drugs and stuff. Like if you have a little puppy dog, the puppy dog can run wild and pass stool all over your house, pass urine, and just cause havoc, right? But if you train that puppy dog, it can become a very, very, helpful, support in your life. So in the same way, our mind is just like a tool. It's just a tool, and we can train it. And I like to connect the within the 6 limbs of surrender, Sharanagati, Anukulyasya Sankalpa Pratikulya Vivarjana. Acceptance of what is favorable to our life of devotion, rejection of what is unfavorable, right? And you know, the mind and habit, right? Habits tied in with the mind too. You just get habits ingrained within you. So sometimes you can just have a habit to, you know, people have self-destructive habits, right? But they're just habits. They can't, it's hard to get out of them because it's just like ingrained in your system. So you can train your mind, wake up at this time, go to bed at this time, train your mind. This is good, this is bad, this is a good person to make friends with, this is a bad person. You can train your mind like that. And the mind should be controlled, subdued by the intellect, right? The intellect, it shouldn't be the other way around. When you have the mind dominating the intellect, you're in trouble. It should be the other way around. That the intellect has the power of discrimination, reason, right? So it's like if you have a 5-year-old child, you know, screaming for chocolate, you know, you can't really reason because that's the mind. They just want this and they want it now. You can't explain, oh, well, this won't be, it's 10 o'clock at night, you need to go to bed and whatever, right? And you're sick, you know, you can't do that, right? So maybe you need to give them some valerian or something to get them to sleep.
Big mug of very, very concentrated chamomile tea.
Okay, chamomile tea. There we go. Thanks. Yeah, I'll just drop that conversation. I was going to say something else to get myself in trouble. Oh, yesterday someone told me something that some parents give their kids to get them to sleep, but I won't repeat that. She said she knows some parents give like a little bit of alcohol, apparently knocks them out. I don't know if that's legal, but apparently some people do. Anyway, I'm not recommending that. Yeah, but the intellect can like steady the mind. Okay, it's too late right now, let's save that chocolate for the morning or lunch or whatever, right? It won't, if I eat it now, I'm not going to sleep, so I'm going to wait. So the intellect has this power of discrimination, reason, analysis. Does that answer your question, Marie? Okay. Yeah. Okay. And then actually here in this verse in Bhagavad Gita, the ego, the ahankara, is not mentioned as part of the layers here, but then that's what's next, before the soul. That's the layer that isn't mentioned here. Above, the more subtle than the intellect, is the ahankara, the plane of ego, and that's the whole, you know, that's the most difficult to overcome because it's very subtle, very insidious. It's very tightly bound up with our sense of identity. It means identity, right? And then more subtle than that, and the true self, that is the Atma, that is the eternal self, the eternal aspect. O mighty Arjuna, knowing the soul to be superior to the intelligence, steady the mind with resolute intelligence and destroy the formidable enemy desire. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I do like to stop on time and everyone has other things to do. Well, it's been a really lovely meeting. Thank you all for your wonderful company, and I love all the interaction that we had today, even from those passively interacting. Any last comments from anyone in our group today? Should we close there? Thank you, Marie, for hosting. Jai Shri Bhakti Sundar Govinda Dev Goswami Maharaj Ki Jai. Shri Bhakti Raksha Sridhar Dev Goswami Maharaj Ki Jai. All the assembled devotees, seekers ki Jai. Shri Hari Nam Sankirtan ki Jai. Jai. Gaur Premanande.
Jai.
Evil. Okay.
Thank you very much today.
Thank you.
Haribol.
See you all next time.